All right. Just get up my notes here. Zoom has changed some things, so it's hard to get rid of some of these windows. All right. First off, welcome. Thank you for all joining us here. Let me tell you a little bit about the Chicago Archaeological Society. For those that are new to this group, we have a long history. From oral tradition, I understand the group started way back in the 1920s when archaeology was still fairly new. Sometime after 1940, Harriet Smith, one of the first female archaeologists, was involved with our group. She directed the first professional large-scale excavations at Cahokia Mounds down state Illinois, close to St. Louis. By at least 1962, the name of the Chicago Archaeological Society was being used, and our mission to study the existence of man was established. After 1969, we became a chapter of the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, the IAAA. At this point, the mission was further expanded to unite all persons interested in archaeology of Illinois, amateurs, professional students, and educators. By at least 1987, we were a paper organization with the state of Illinois. In short, like the IAAA, we do focus on regional areas of interest, but in the pursuit of understanding mankind, we do often venture off into the ancient Americas, such as the Maya, Egypt, ancient Peru, things like that. As a member of the Chicago Archaeological Society, you will receive a copy of our newsletter, The Codex, which covers recent, past, and future lectures, plus news and events. Also, you'll become a member of the IAAA, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. You will get a copy of the Illinois Antiquity, a journal of the Archaeological Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, that has wonderful articles and photos about the work that's being done throughout the state of Illinois. If you would like to find out more, please go to our website, chicagoarchaeologicalsociety.com. Join our mailing list. Send an email to info@chicagoarchaeology.org. All right, that was a mouthful. All right, want to say thank you to all of our current and past members for your support. Without you, none of this would be possible. We completely rely on dues and donations from our members. And again, thank you. Without you, none of this would be possible. Again, find out more, chicagoarchaeologicalsociety.com. Last month, we had a wonderful talk from Dr. Heather Walder and Martin Defoe, Tribal Historical Preservation Officer, connecting people past and present, collaborative archaeology in Red Cliff, Wisconsin. We had a great talk that was a lot of fun. And next month, please come on back, May 23rd at 3:30, and hear from Dr. Matthew Crystal. It's our tradition to maintain the forest, indigenous water management in San Miguel, Totonicapán. But today, we have Sara Pfannkuche. She is an archaeologist and will soon have her PhD in anthropology from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is not only knowledgeable about regional history and archaeology, but is also a leader and friend to our organization. Beginning in 2006, Sara expanded her work on historic and prehistoric sites to include museum curation, archaeological collections, and designing exhibits and tours. She helped open 2 museums, including the Pick Museum of Anthropology at Northern Illinois University, where she was an interim director. And in 2018, she co-founded the Midwest Heritage Resource Consultants, which specializes in archaeology, museum planning, curation, and exhibit design. She is also a past president of the IAAA, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, of which we belong. Please give a warm welcome to Sara, discussing where people lived in the Pecatonica River Valley during the Middle Holocene, 5,000 to 500 BCE. All right, let's see if we can unmute Sara. Oh, I just muted her when she unmuted. Okay.
There I go.
There you go. All right. Now I am going to stop my share so that she can share her screen.
And I think I have done that. Ray, can you see it?
Let me confirm. Yes, I can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for inviting me today. I listened to Heather's talk last month and it was wonderful and fun and full of good stories. This is more theoretical. So I'm going to warn you, there's not going to be a lot of archaeological site pictures or artifact pictures. It's more theory based, so it might be a little bit more dry. So fair warning now. But thank you for having me here. I do like to I love talking to IAAA people. I've been to a few of your meetings. I hope in the future when we can get together, I can be at your meetings in the future. So I'm going to get right to the talk. I'm going to be talking about the Pecatonica River and how, basically I'm going to give you a talk about my dissertation. The thing is though, my dissertation is looking at settlement patterns of the Pecatonica River using geographic information systems, a GIS analysis. I'm going to tell you right up front, my GIS analysis has not been completed. So I don't have answers that I can give you. So basically what this talk is going to be is setting up my GIS and then letting you know with the conclusions what I think I'm going to find. So to get started, oops, I have to do this though, if I wanted to do that. To get started, I'm going to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. This is the slide you're seeing right now is the only wordy slide you're going to see for the entire talk. Mostly you're going to see maps, but I do try to keep the wordiness out of my slides, except when I talk the outline. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief introduction, what I'm basically doing right now. Then I'm going to tell you why I am interested in this topic. After that, I'm going to give you some background, such as where is the Pecatonica River located and what is the hypsothermal, because that time period of the hypsothermal, the mid-Holocene, that 5,000 to 500 BCE is the time period that I'm looking at. After that, I'm going to talk to you about the theory, what is settlement pattern analysis and how is it used? I'm going to talk then about applying current settlement pattern analyses to the Pecatonica River and why it's problematic and why I am basically the problems of the modern analysis being applied to a river and therefore why I need to create a new analysis. I'll then talk about the data I'm using to create my Pecatonica River settlement pattern analysis. And then I'll follow that with my conclusion of what I think I'm going to find once the GIS is run. And I'll promise you right now that once that GIS is run and I can finish writing up my dissertation, I'll report back to you guys what the actual verdict of the study was. But first, I want to talk about real quick what I will not be discussing, right? As I said, the dissertation is still in progress, so I don't really have answers for you. I will also like to state that I'm not going to be using the terms Middle Archaic, Late Archaic, or Early Woodland. I know these are terms that most people are used to when referring to different time periods, especially in Illinois. We usually think that the Middle Archaic is 6,000 to 3,000 BC. Late Archaic is 3,000 to 1,000. These terms are problematic because they are applied both temporally and culturally, and they don't always match up. If you use the term late archaic as a chronological time period, as a temporal time period, meaning that late archaic is between 3,000 and 1,000 BCE, that might not apply for areas in Wisconsin the same way they apply to areas in Illinois. So I am not going to be using those terms. I'm going to be talking a lot about the middle Holocene and the late Holocene. And so basically, even though I won't say it, a lot of my focus is the middle Archaic and the late Archaic, what most people think about those time periods. So why am I looking at my topic? And the reason is I started very early on in the mid 1990s to start working on a site called MacTown. And if I remember right, I think Chicago Archaeological Society has actually visited that site in the past. Maybe not recently, but I think you guys are out there in the past. MacTown is a site that's located in Rockton, Illinois, about 3 miles south of Beloit, Wisconsin, at the confluence of the Rock and Pecatonica rivers. MARS, Midwest Archaeological Research Services, surveyed that site in 1993. And this map right here shows what they found. All of the dots are shovel probes that were positive. The yellow areas are where historic buildings and historic artifacts were found. We do know that there's a town that dates to the 1830s to 1850s out there. But what was more shocking to us is the amount of prehistoric material found at the site. All these black dots were prehistoric materials that were found. And that material dated from 8000 BCE all the way up to the present. When we went to visit the site in 1994 to figure out what we were going to do out there in the future, excavation-wise, we found out that there was a giant shell site about 70 meters long along the bank right here. You can see part of it exposed in this picture. We knew that this was a magnificent site. We knew that you couldn't figure out what was going on in this site just by a couple of weeks of work there, and that there was going to be a long-term excavation plan for the site. Prior to any excavation at this location, we had thought that the shell site might be an adaptation to the persistence of the hypsothermal. And I'll talk about the hypsothermal in a little bit, but right now it is a time where summers were about 2 degrees Celsius warmer than they are now. It was persistent drought, took place during the middle Holocene. And it is the end of the hypsothermal that kind of our climate, modern climate that we have today was established. And so we know that this was a time of stress for Native American peoples. With a warming climate, their resources, food sources may have changed, and they had to adapt to that. Studies by James Thieler in the driftless region of Wisconsin identified that he believed that people started using shell resources, mussels basically, added to their diet to compensate for the changing environment, to making sure they had enough food. We thought because the MacTown site was where the Pecatonica and the rock came together, and the Pecatonica drained the driftless region where Thieler was doing his settlement analysis, that we may be having the same thing occurring there. So we ended up doing our first excavations at the MacTown site along that shell site. That's when we did this excavation. There's another one up on top that Loyola did a couple years later. What we found out was the shell sites that we had at MacTown post-dated the end of the hypsothermal. So the earliest date that we have to that shell processing was 1800 years ago, about 1,000 years after the hypsothermal ended and our modern climate had started. So it wasn't in connection with that the mussel started being used. However, I became interested in looking at how people would have adjusted to climate change. This picture, by the way, this map right here is some of the more recent excavations that have taken place at MacTown, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I am interested in looking at the hypsothermal because it was a time of climate crisis in a way, granted a 2,000, 3,000 year period. But I started thinking about how people back then would have adapted to a changing climate when you didn't know where it would end, how it started, what was going on with it. And I started thinking about our own times, the climate change that we're having, which I will say is very different from the climate change back then. And I'll explain that when we talk about the hypsothermal. I also became interested in the Pecatonica River. This is where the Mactown site is located. You can see here's the Pecatonica patterns that they have seen on the Rock River here. And I kept asking, well, what about the Pecatonica? My reason for asking that is that I had done some work at the Logan Museum of Anthropology and knew about the survey in 1974 of the Pecatonica, in which they found all of these sites. Everything red you see here are archaeological sites. And this is the Pecatonica site, or sorry, this is the Mactown site where my cursor is. So even though everybody was applying what they knew about the Rock River to the site, I kept asking, well, people were living on the Pecatonica. Why aren't we talking about how people were adapted to the Pecatonica to how they would have used that site? And then we realized there wasn't really much work done on the Pecatonica, and that's why I was drawn into doing that work on the Pecatonica. Although Mactown is located on the Pecatonica and the Rock, I want to focus, as I said, I want to focus on that. Okay, so that's how I got involved into this project, my dissertation research. So at this point, I want to make a really quick aside and give you some information about the region and about what the hypsothermal is. So first of all, the region itself. The Pecatonica River is located in both north central Illinois and southwestern Wisconsin. It's about 120 miles long. It starts by Cobb and Linden in two specific different branches that come together outside of Browntown. This area, everything to the left of this yellow line that you see here, is the driftless region of Wisconsin. It is an area that has never been glaciated. It covers not only Wisconsin, but parts of Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. It was never completely surrounded by glaciers, but glaciers always kind of abutted the different sides of it. This pink line here is the edge, excuse me, of the Wisconsin glaciation. So you could see how the Wisconsin glaciation would have come to the eastern edge of the driftless region. This area here was glaciated during Illinoian times. That is about 125,000 years ago. And so that glacier would have come from the west down this way and would have butted to the west and south side of the driftless region. The Pecatonica, I think, is unique is because even though it's a small little river, you have so much variety in landforms because you have this unglaciated area, and this glaciated area that not only had Illinoisan drift on it, glacial drift, but also Wisconsin outwash deposits on it. And so it's a very unique kind of river. The Rock River doesn't have it. The Rock River is all through glaciated lands. The Mississippi River is just a massively different river than the Pecatonica. You can see here the Pecatonica flows mostly west to east, which is also very different from other rivers. For those of you who might know this area a little bit, you'll know that there is what's called the Military Ridge right here that divides the driftless region to rivers that flow southward, like the Pecatonica, to the Rock River, and rivers that flow northward to the Wisconsin. As I said, the Pecatonica enters the Rock River by Rockton, which is about 3 miles south of Beloit. When I study this river, I am looking at particularly the Wisconsin reach of the river, which is basically the driftless region, and the Illinois reach, which is the glaciated region. This is a picture of the Pecatonica right where it starts forming outside of Linden. It's very similar, the west branch that is formed right outside of Cobb. But by the time you're into Lafayette County here, the river, both branches, has become full of meanders. It moves around its narrow valley. It switches very back and forth. There's a lot of oxbow lakes. Those oxbow lakes are something that has occurred in the more recent time, post-hypsothermal, probably starting about 4000 BC. This area of the Pecatonica in Illinois, the valley gets much larger. The Pecatonica Valley actually gets about 2 miles across. It's called an underfit stream because the stream itself is only about 30 or 50 feet across usually. In the summertime, if you're up in this area, you could actually walk across it, no problem. It's maybe up to your upper thighs if the ground's not too muddy and you don't sink in it. But the valley is built for a much larger river system, which the Pecatonica was millions and millions of years ago. So, sorry, I'm a little bit confusing myself. So there's a little bit of information about the Pecatonica in itself. I now want to talk about the hypsothermal, because I'm not sure if everybody is quite sure about what that is. The hypsothermal is a period of warmer summers that had decreased precipitation, which seemed to be caused by a change in the Earth's orbital tilt. Our tilt was more than it is today, and so the higher latitudes of the northern hemisphere had longer exposure to the sun, which allowed for summer temperatures to rise by about 2 degrees Celsius. This is a map that was created by NOAA, and it shows that this is during the hypsothermal, a time about 7500 BP that lasted to about 3500 BP. And you can see it's the time that this black line is pretty much above the 0, which is considered normal. During that time, you can see on this map, even though winters were just slightly colder, they weren't too much different than today, but summers were up to 2 degrees Celsius warmer. And as we know from today's climate change, which is human-made and has been moving forward much more dramatically and faster than in the past, 2 degrees Celsius is a major difference. It means increased sea level, increased extremes of storms, more drought in some areas, more rain in other areas. And at this time, what we call the hypsothermal, it was a time of more aridity, less rain. The term hypsothermal is an archaeological term. Climatologists have moved away from that and have called it now the climatic optimum, because you can see here how low the temperature was. This is coming out of the Ice Age, that it was just this movement out of the Ice Age where we kicked up to higher temperatures, and then we dropped back down. This real low spot, if you're wondering, that's a little ice age of the 1600s. But it's around this time that the hypsothermal ended around 4500 BP, that what we call our modern climate. And when I use modern, I mean pre-modern climate change, modern climate came about. And when that modern climate came about, our modern vegetation that we have came about. So let me tell you a little bit more about the hypsothermal, probably more than you ever want to know. After 9000 BP, a warming climate was accompanied with increasing aridity, creating drought conditions beginning in the Great Plains before extending eastward. Its spread in time depended on its geographic location. You could kind of see how it spreaded by the increase of the Prairie Peninsula. The Prairie Peninsula covers Illinois. It's something you might have heard before. That term, the Prairie Peninsula, was identified and first used in the first half of the 20th century. And it represents an area of tall grass prairie with small areas of savannas that developed with the onset of the warm, dry period of the hypsothermal that spread into Illinois, Iowa, Missouri during the Middle Archaic. High resolution speleothem calcite records from caves in northeast Iowa indicate that the prairie environment rapidly developed by 5900 BP in this area. Prairie grasses dominate pollen diagrams in south central and southeastern Wisconsin, this area, between 5500 and 5200 BP. And in Illinois, prairie begins to dominate between 8500 and 7900 BP, first occurring on the southern edges of the peninsula and then moving northward over time. So you can see the prairie peninsula expanded as the warming and drying occurred. Tall grass prairie used to be out here. It kept moving, kept moving. By the end of the hypsothermal, it brought an increase in average moisture, if not in temperature. But like its beginning, the ending was time transgressive, but it usually is considered to have occurred between 4000 and 3000 BP. And with the ending of the hypsothermal, this prairie peninsula started to shrink back. Changes in moisture affected larger river valleys, making rivers like the Mississippi and Illinois shift from braided channels to sluggish rivers that contain backwater wetlands. The end of the hypsothermal did not bring the collapse of the Prairie Peninsula, but added savannas on the uplands and oak-dominated vegetation on the floodplains. Although small-scale variations occurred in climate after 3000 BP, such as megadroughts and the Little Ice Age, the vegetation patterns formed at the end of the hypsothermal remain relatively constant through modern times. So how does this prairie peninsula that developed through the hypsothermal affect people in the Pecatonica River Valley? So here's the full extent of the prairie peninsula in the upper right. This map is the tall grass prairie, the remnants of that prairie peninsula today. We believe that we, meaning archaeologists and environmental historians, believe that prairie and savanna vegetation was more prominent along the Illinois reach of the Pecatonica, this area, south of the state line, than in the Wisconsin reach. In the Wisconsin area, you had more forested areas that were dominated by oak, silver maple, black willow, and cottonwood. The Wisconsin reach of the Pecatonica had pretty much half prairie, half forested area. And that is because it was on this northern extent of the Prairie Peninsula that pulled back and disappeared. And so the prairie wasn't as extensive up here as it would have been in the more central area of the Prairie Peninsula. Because of that, a river that flowed through a prairie area of the Prairie Peninsula into its northern extreme, where you have a mix of forest and prairie, would have a variety of ecotones to get food and resources from, giving them a wider diversity of food to be able to supplement themselves during any climate changes that they would have to deal with. I'm hoping with my settlement pattern analysis to be able to kind of show that people were able to maintain their lifestyles on the Pecatonica because of their ability to use different resources available to them, because of the location of this river valley and because of the different environments that are found within this small little river valley, and also because of the different landforms within it being glacial and unglaciated. So I want to also not only explain the hypsothermal to you, but give you a little bit of idea of the archaeology that's already been done for the Pecatonica area. I've already mentioned that there's been work at the Mactown site. The shell site that has been looked at is located in this area. We've done large excavations right in the shell, on terraces above the shell, the village site above the shell site. we've also done a lot of archaeology on the historic buildings out there. But the thing is, when you're working at Mactown, Native people use this entire landform. And so all of the historic structures and historic archaeology goes through prehistoric layers. In fact, one of the first archaeology to be done at Mactown was a cultural resource management program of the Mac house itself, which is located right here. And what they found out was that the foundation of the front porch was put into prehistoric pits that were put in by Middle Woodland people. So we have a lot of information about prehistoric times out here. We do know it was used from 8000 BC into modern times. We knew that voyageurs were using that area. Unfortunately, most of the work that we've done out there have found features and pits that date to the woodland, the last 2000, 2500 years, what occurred during the late Holocene. Not that much work from the middle Holocene, which is slightly problematic when you're doing research like me. More work out in the Pecatonica. The majority of the work, at least in the Illinois Reach, has been done in 1974 during the Pecatonica River Survey by Beloit College. That was part of the Illinois Historic Site Survey. Beloit College was asked to survey the Pecatonica River, which is right here on this map. They were able to do it for 1 year in 1974, and they were able to survey all of this area. Prior to that survey, only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sites were known from the confluence of the river out to Sherland, Illinois. After that survey, that Mactown's located where my cursor is right now. Sherland is located right there. Over 100 sites were found just in that year. Unfortunately, the survey was funded, but the analysis of the artifacts were not founded. So all this information, even though a small report and inventorying was done, sat on a shelf, and nothing happened to it for quite a while. And I thought that that data would be very good to start looking at the Pecatonica River Valley. Now, sorry, I also want to say that other work that's been done on the Pecatonica has been cultural resource management projects. Cultural resource management projects are archaeological projects that are being done due to federal law or state law. When roads or sewers or power lines have federal money, sometimes archaeology has to be done. The state of Illinois also has state laws that when state money is used, archaeology has to be done. Wisconsin doesn't have that state law. So a lot of the Illinois sites along the Pecatonica have been found through CRM. In Wisconsin, most of the sites found along the Pecatonica have come from private collectors that have shared the information and their sites that they have found with archaeologists who were able to record it with the state of Wisconsin. Same has occurred in Illinois, though not to the amount as occurred in Wisconsin. So that's the river, the Pecatonica River. I told you a little bit about the hypsothermal. Now I have to talk to you guys about settlement patterns. This is the theory part of the talk, so just bear with me. Settlement pattern analysis is used by archaeologists to identify the spatial relationships of different types of sites utilized by specific populations within a region. Well-known archaeologist Howard Winter, who did the survey of the Wabash River, which is the border of Illinois and Indiana, and studied what he called the river tin culture, said, quote, "The geographic and physiographic relations of contemporaneous groups of sites within a single culture is the purpose of settlement pattern analysis. The objectives of settlement pattern analysis is to assess the ecological variability and productive potential within a study area, locate sites in that area, classify the sites into a meaningful taxa or identify what they were used for, assign the sites into a temporal affiliation, and finally evaluate functional differences between the sites. By recognizing patterns, archaeologists attempt to identify the potential variables that go into the decision-making process regarding where a group resided, found their food, buried their dead, got their resources. In addition, archaeologists attempt to identify variables within the environment or the society that cause a change to the pattern. This analysis is based on the recovery of material culture from sites, from scatters, and isolated finds, often with the assumption that the material culture used to identify specific sites represent the different activities that occurred at each site location. The most often used approach for settlement pattern analysis is called landscape archaeology. Landscape archaeology is a theoretical approach and a methodology used by archaeologists for over 60 years to study the interaction between humans and the physical places they occupy. This approach uses regional archaeological surveys that include investigations at all geomorphic landforms within the study area to identify potential archaeological locations for a specific population, as well as identify areas lacking in archaeological material. The earliest use of landscape studies began in geography, and then this is his publication, and the River Valley in Peru is located in this location. It wasn't until this publication that landscape study was fully embraced by archaeologists. Wiley's idea was taking Julian Seward's idea. Julian Seward was the developer of cultural ecology, that cultural changes were influenced by the environment, but, and this is important, that the environment did not determine the outcome of these changes. In the United States, interest in landscape archaeology started with James B. Griffin in 1956, who attempted to identify settlement patterns of the northern Mississippi Valley and Great Lakes, mostly based on previous archaeological excavations. He did not focus specifically on landforms, but on structures, ceremonial activities, exchanges, and military activities that he was able to find evidence for. By the 1960s, various landscape archaeological surveys were being conducted to identify settlement patterns within major river valleys where archaeological sites were known to exist and had been previously studied. Some of this was the work by Howard Winters, which was this publication of the Riverton culture, but also work by Alan Harn in the Cahokia area, which is, here's a map and some of the sites that he identified in putting together a Cahokian settlement pattern. But the most famous was work done by Stuart Strever in 1968 on the lower Illinois River Valley, and that is the part of the river where it comes into the Mississippi River. These are sites that he was able to identify and work with. It was the settlement pattern analysis for the lower Illinois River Valley, which is a major Midwest river system. The main goal that Strever had with his settlement pattern analysis was to look at available food resources to identify the associated system, where they were sitting, the sites were located, and the location of where food was being gathered. By the 1970s, large-scale regional activities were being conducted throughout the Midwest. The Illinois was doing what's called the Illinois Historic Site Survey. That was universities were taking part in surveying large river systems throughout the state of Illinois. The Pecatonica River Survey was one of those surveys done late in this project, but the Rock River, here marked as number 10, was done early on and continuously from 1971 all the way through actually 1976. And these are some of the artifacts that was found. That was a survey done by the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. The survey was conducted at least through 1974 with the National Park Service, the Illinois Department of Conservation, and the Illinois Archaeological Survey. And these were really important surveys in getting the data that we needed to start doing settlement pattern analysis for various river systems. For example, in 1972, these surveys recorded over 1,500 sites within the state of Illinois, just adding more data for archaeologists to use for comparison. Later on, I'm gonna just skip, okay. I just have been realizing how long I've been talking, and then so I'm gonna skip a little bit ahead so I don't get too far and too full into my theory. We do at this point have an idea that what, sorry, a good idea of what a settlement pattern for the Midwest looks like. It has been proposed by numerous people. And it's been published in this book. Many of you might be familiar with it, from 2009, Archaic Societies, Diversity and Complexity Across the Mid-Continent, in which each chapter in it basically is a discussion of a settlement pattern analysis for a variety of river systems. Based on these regional surveys, a Midwest settlement pattern has been put forward for Northern Illinois on how indigenous populations experienced and adapted during the time of climate change of the hypsothermal. These patterns were developed through various work done in Northeast Illinois, West Central Illinois, Eastern Iowa, and Southern Wisconsin, and was brought together through this publication. During the maximum extension of the Prairie Peninsula into Illinois, Indiana, between 6,800 to 3,200 calibrated years before present, the indigenous populations were hunter-gatherers that lived near riverine and lake resources, which they utilized from late spring through late fall. Although they may have spent a few months in one location, groups of people, if not the whole group, would move around the landscape to various resources when they became available. They spent the winter of the year in smaller family groups hunting in the uplands. Near the end of the hypsothermal, during what many consider to be the Middle Archaic to Late Archaic transition, riverine regimes changed from braided to meandering rivers. This change created more oxbow lakes and marshland that provided additional food resources. People then relied on increasingly diverse resources such as mussels, fish, and wetland plants found in backwater locations, all found within the major river valleys. Specific resources were still targeted on the uplands, such as nuts and deer, but the focus became the floodplain and not the uplands. A slightly different approach may have occurred in the driftless region, which is the Wisconsin stretch of the Pecatonica. There, groups may have spent fall and winter in rock shelters away from the major river valleys and intensively harvested deer and possibly even elk. Reliance on a purely hunting and gathering system has been questioned in recent years. With the recovery of domesticated squash, chenopodium, and other possible seeds from Midwest sites dating to near or the ending of the hypsothermal during what we call the late Archaic. It should be noted that the location of the recovered domesticated plants on late Archaic sites have been found from riverine locations, not from upland settings. So the use of domesticated plants for upland populations is still unknown. Although the first appearance of domesticated plants coincides with the ending of the hypsothermal and the establishment of the modern climate, I do not, and in fact, most archaeologists do not suggest that there is a one-to-one correlation between the two events. It is not proposed that climate change forced cultural change. Any disruptions caused by a changing climate is dependent on how specific cultures reacted to that change. For some cultures, disruptions may be absorbed, while other societies may change their subsistence, settlement pattern, or even their customs. The timing of any change, if they occur, is also dependent on the specific culture. For changes may occur quickly, occur after a significant lag, or be a temporary shift before the original culture characteristics are reestablished. In a way, think of how we are responding to today's modern climate changes. Some countries act swiftly, others slowly, while others don't at all. Now, there are some problems with this modern settlement pattern analysis when you apply it directly to the Pecatonica River. As I said, most people will look at the rocks settlement pattern analysis because that is the one that has been done more often, has been looked at. The rock is in fact the major river for the area. The Pecatonica is part of the Rock River's watershed. On the upper right of your map is the watershed of the Rock River within Wisconsin. In that area, you can see that there are a lot of lakes and smaller tributaries. The Pecatonica, which would be right in this location, does not have as many of those, very few of those lakes and tributaries that the Rock has. The Rock is also a much not only larger river, but when it flows down to its mouth, it enters the Mississippi River. So this whole area of the Rock has many more resources because of the Mississippi than the Pecatonica has. And although people of the Pecatonica can get down here, their everyday lives will not be affected by anything on the Mississippi Trench. The landscape of the Pecatonica is also very different from the Rock. It is an incised river, especially when it gets into the Illinois reach. It has cliffs along its bluffs in many locations. These are things, again, resources that the Pecatonica doesn't have. So you can't just apply a settlement system from the Rock River on the Pecatonica because you don't have any similar kind of resources, environment, landscape, or even geographic landforms that would be similar. There's also another problem, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is dealing with certain terms. When you apply, let's say, a settlement pattern from north central Illinois, which is the Rock River, from southern Wisconsin, that includes both the driftless and the non-driftless region, from northern Wisconsin, from southwest Wisconsin, just the driftless region, you're going to be using temporal time period terms, such as the Middle Archaic, the Late Archaic, that are also applied to cultural terms, the Middle Archaic people, the Late Archaic people. The Pecatonica River flows through southwest Wisconsin into north central Illinois. However, when they cross the state boundary, which did not exist at the time of Aboriginal population, they did not change temporal or cultural names just because they crossed the line. Southwest Wisconsin has the start of the Middle Archaic, discussed by Thieler and Bozart as beginning in 3000 BC, while in north central Illinois, that same cultural period of the Middle Archaic starts at 6000 BC. This Radix point we often call a Middle Archaic point, dating to 6000 to 4000 BC. And it is a common point of the Middle Holocene, a time period during the Hypsothermal. But that 6000 to 4000 BC period may actually be occurring during the temporal period of the early Archaic in southwest Wisconsin, or the Middle Archaic in north central or other parts of southern Wisconsin. So that using these settlement patterns for other areas and then trying to apply it to the Pecatonica using terms that are used in other areas, it creates this temporal, cultural hodgepodge in which you might be a Middle Archaic cultural person using early Archaic or late Archaic tools, which is, again, why I'm switching and just using Middle Holocene for this kind of discussion. All right, so let me tell you what I'm going to be looking at for data before I rattle on way too long. First off, I'm going to be running a GIS, Geographic Information Systems analysis for determining my settlement pattern. GIS modeling will be used to model the archaeological data to identify settlement patterns for the region during the Middle Holocene. Geographic Information Systems provides a way to look at landscape reconstruction and model human movement across regions in ways unknown to earlier practitioners of landscape archaeology. Indigenous people needed certain resources for survival, such as water and firewood, flora and faunal resources, which were used for their food. Because the importance of these resources, their locations and availability to local populations must be considered. For example, if critical resources were missing in an area, such as the lack of water, then it would not be surprising that people did not live in that area. If, however, all the resources necessary for survival could be found and still no population utilized the area, archaeologists must look for other reasons for the area's abandonment. Archaeological data used for this analysis will identify where sites are located during the mid-Holocene and potentially what activities were done at the sites. identifying activities will be based on lithic analysis. The specific data that I'm using will include survey data. Most of my survey data comes from an area right across from the Mactown site at the confluence again of the Pecatonica and Rock River on the west side in what is the Nigrin Wetland Preserve. A lot of that area had been surveyed both in the 1974 Pecatonica River Survey by Beloit College, but also during cultural resource management surveys due to the relicensing of the Rockton Hydroelectric Dam. I wanted to verify the veracity of those surveys, if they actually found the material, if they where they thought they found it, if they wrote it up and described it properly. What I found out is that those surveys were actually, they found sites, but not all of the sites. For example, this location right here where the red is what is this site right here, was recorded after the 1974 survey and also these relicensing of the Rockton Hydroelectric Dam. Our survey from about 10 years ago showed that the site was actually much larger. All this dark purple and light purple are additional sites within it. And also that they missed other sites that were quite right next door. This was another survey that was done that incorporated this area. The red were the original sites that were recorded in 1974. The red were redefinitions of those sites on the modern survey. We were able to re-identify what those site locations should be by rereading the notes. A lot of these earlier sites were just mapped wrong. They had to be also transferred across multiple maps. This is before computer generated movement of data. And so some of this was just mismapped over time. And the surveys were able to re-identify site locations. I'm also looking at the actual site files that both Wisconsin and Illinois has. This is the Wisconsin reach of the Pecatonica River. Here you have the West Branch. Here you have the East Branch. And this is the Illinois reach. Everything in red is an archaeological site. I know it looks very small probably on your screens, and I apologize for that, but you're looking at 120 miles here. And you can see there are a lot of sites. I'm using all of this data to identify all of the sites that are date to the mid-Holocene to try to figure out what landforms, what soils they are sitting on. Now, this is the hardest part of my form for Illinois from the early, that was used from the early 1950s through the 1990s. They changed that site form in the mid 1990s. And so how data was recorded on sites changed over time. How that data was then put into a computer changed over time. So I have to try to code all the data within the Illinois site files the same way. And comparing that, here's a Wisconsin site form. They record data completely differently. They ask for different data. Sometimes they don't ask for the same amount of information. Sometimes information is left blank. I have to take these two completely separate databases and merge them together to get the data that I need. That is what has been taking so long on my GIS analysis. Other things I'm looking at is private collections. I had hopes that I would be able to look at about 5 to 8 different private collections and add their data to the site data, but COVID hit and I was not able to actually talk to all the people that I wanted to. I couldn't visit the institutions. There's still 2 private collections I want to look at that I am not allowed to visit their lab for another 6 months. So instead of pushing off my dissertation, we're just basically writing them off. But the 2 main collections I am able to look at are the Frank Osborne collection, that's the first one, and that is housed at the Burpee Museum of Natural History in Rockford. Frank Osborne was an active collector of the Rock River and the Pecatonica River from the late 1890s through 1950. He had material in his house. I was told a newspaper described it as a museum. He allowed people to go visit him at his house. He donated most of his material to the Burpee Museum, and we do know that he probably donated a lot of paperwork. Osborne and 70 sites in Ogle County when we started recording sites. That material is going to the Burpee Museum. However, most museums were not professionally staffed into the 1990s. And because of that, the collection of Frank Osborne kind of languished and got mixed up, and the paperwork got separated from from the actual artifacts. And so when I went and looked at the material, this is how it's sitting in the drawer. This is some material that does date to the mid-Holocene that will be included in the data analysis. You can see that only 9 artifacts, 6 of which are not chipped stone tools, come from Winnebago County. 9 artifacts for over 70 sites. We do know that there's a number of Winnebago County artifacts missing and might now be in this category of they don't know where they came from anymore. But I did an analysis of this material, and at least I can say what county they're from. The other private collection I looked at was the Froebel collection that is housed at the Logan Museum of Anthropology. That was a collection that was donated in the early 2000s. The gentleman collected in the late 20th century, all over Northern Illinois, but he did collect on the Pecatonica River. And these are 2 collections from sites he found on the Pecatonica that does have Middle Holocene artifacts from. Many times he did write down just Pecatonica River, Freeport, Illinois, but in a number of sites, he actually wrote down a specific location. So that kind of geomorphic, I could identify the landform it sits on, where it is on the Pecatonica, and again, add that to my database. I'm also doing analysis of legacy collections. So I ended up looking at the entire collection of that 1974 Pecatonica River Survey, over 10,000 artifacts for that collection. I also, because the Pecatonica does dump into the Rock River, I wanted to look at the Rock River in Winnebago County. So I looked at the Rock River survey that UW-Milwaukee did, also for that Illinois Historic Site Survey, and that was another about 3,000 artifacts that got added to the collection. Sometimes artifacts were misidentified, recorded in the wrong location, and so I was able to fix that and better clarify where sites of the Middle Holocene were located. I also looked at collections, cultural resource management collections of the area to, again, verify that the information from those site reports were correct and matched what was found on the site forms that I'm using for the site database. Again, these are some artifacts that were found from this site that I pointed out earlier that was found at Nygren. I also did excavations. Unfortunately for me, my excavations at Mactown and Nygren area ended up finding a lot of late Holocene material. Here we found ceramics and features from 1,000 years ago. Here are ceramics from 2,000 years ago. This is Nygren. This is Mactown. We were not able to find excavation in situ features for the mid-Holocene, which does create a slight problem because I was hoping to get faunal material and floral material to suggest where Aboriginal people were getting their food. So that was lacking. I do need some environmental factors in my database, and so I am looking at GLOs, General Land Office maps. These General Land Office maps were created when the land was first surveyed. This one was done in 1840. This is the Mactown site is located right here. These are great because the environment, the vegetation represented at this time pretty much represented what it was like post hypsothermal, so the beginning of the modern climate. And you can tell where timber's located, where prairie's located, where the wetlands are, and you can recreate that to suggest where these niches, where the different ecotones came together, prairie and woodland, and that would be where the greatest amount of food resources were going to be located. I'm also looking at soil maps, both soil associations and specific soils. Soils can tell you the percent of slope at a location, how well drained it is, if there's erosion, what geomorphic landform it's located on, what kind of vegetation was there when the soil first developed. So it gives you a lot of good environmental data. The problem is that soils are determined by each county. So I have 5 counties involved. Originally, I had 847 different categories of soil. This is Mactown right here. This is Sherland right here. And you can see on this map how much soil, specific varieties of soil there are. By removing all of the duplicates, I dropped that down to 692. There's a little bit more massaging of this data because Wisconsin uses a alphanumeric classification system on their soils, and Illinois uses purely a numerical. And so I now have to merge and figure those 2 things out to get this data to play nice in my GIS analysis. So in the end, I'm going to put all of these different types of data together into my GIS system and ask it what kind of settlement pattern analysis I have. And in conclusion, so I'm almost done, just bear with me a little bit more. I'm going to tell you what I think I'm going to find and what I hope to find. First of all, I think that the indigenous people within the Pecatonica River Valley during the mid-Holocene may have relied on multiple types of settlement patterns, depending on the specific geological resources, non-glaciated versus glaciated landscapes of the reach of the river. However, due to the diversity within the river valley, the settlement patterns used did not need to alter significantly due to the climate change with the ending of the hypsothermal, so that they were able to basically maintain their settlement patterns, plural, because they used the river differently depending on what the geological area was. With the changing, they were able to maintain that during changing climate because they had such a diverse landscape, food resources to go to. Secondly, I believe that settlement patterns that cross modern political boundaries, such as states or county lines, will have unique problems that must be overcome in order to generate a successful settlement pattern model. There is a reason that settlement pattern models are pretty much restricted to one state. Even if you look at places such as the Mississippi River Valley, usually it's done on one side of the river or the other side. That's because the data collected, if you were going to put those 2 states together, you'll have the same problems that I have, that the data just does not speak nicely to each other, and you have to end up spending so much time massaging the data to get your particular answers. So it's going to be a call kind of for modern political systems to consider their neighbors and archaeologists and try to get their data to work better together. So that is my presentation to you all. I hope I didn't bore you too much with all of the theoretical talk. Sorry, I don't have answers for you, but I'll give it back to Ray. If you have questions, I guess you could put it in the chat. And thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a wonderful talk. And as she said, yeah, please add your questions to the chat, direct them to everyone so everyone can see them. I'd be glad to read them. Or if you feel comfortable being on camera and talking, you're welcome to unmute yourself at this time and ask questions that way too.
I know I threw a lot of things out there.
I have a quick question to start things off. You showed the picture with all the oxbow lakes and how much the Pecatonica has been meandering.
Yes.
How significant is that meandering during this time period in the regard of how many, I mean, do you think it's been scrubbing these sites clean and erasing sites? Is that
Yeah,
an issue?
I think so. And that's why early on I talked about the potential for buried deposits, and that when you look at settlement patterns, you have to realize that things might be missing due to scrubbing away of the landscape. Larger river systems, you have alluvial burying, alluvial deposits that will bury these sites. In the Pecatonica, because of this change from the braided to the meandering river, I think it's going to be erasure, like you said, that the river's moving back and forth across the river valley and will basically, as it moves, and I can show you this right here. I believe, can you guys see that? Oh, wait, can you guys see that? This is an area oxbows have specific years that haven't dated. And so this right here would date anywhere from 38.
Chicago Archaeological Society slot is what's now. You got Archaic Society's slide. That's the one you want, right?
The one that has the picture of the archaic societies. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. All right. So this bottom where my cursor is moving, that is a terrace, an old kind of oxbow that dates from 4600 to 3800 BP. And we know the river moved from this location to this location around 2000 BP and is now at this location. So nothing in this area is going to predate this date. And if people lived over here, when the river was over here, that site is now gone. And so that's what part of the problem is, that this earlier middle Holocene time period, especially before the rivers turned to the system that they have today, this meandering system, there's going to be a lot of missing sites. And so when you do the settlement pattern analysis, you do need a lot of this kind of, just because you might have a time period not well represented doesn't mean that people didn't live there. It means that you need to look at it and say, oh, is there landscape there today that they would have been able to live on? Further down where the Pecatonica enters the Rock River, by Mactown, by this Nigran Forest Preserve, let's see, here. Pecatonica is right here in this map. The Raccoon Creek is right here. And we did excavations on this site right here. That's the Kettle Knoll site. And we thought we had an old Pecatonica terrace. And what we found out, we had a geomorphologist come in, we did not. At one point, the Pecatonica was over here. And then it moved southward. And then the Raccoon Creek kind of claimed those old terraces. So we have a pretty good thought right now that most of the sites that dating to anything older than 5000 BC is not going to be represented here, that they've just been eaten away as the river moves around. So that is a serious problem that we have with this kind of analysis. It's best to have a lot of geomorphological work done, which unfortunately I don't have that much. And part of this work I'm hoping is that people will start looking at the Pecatonica and trying to date various terraces, various oxbows to get this idea of where we have missing sites in the future. Good question.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Lori. What indigenous groups live there or are there now?
Good question. So when we think of indigenous groups, a lot of times we think of, what we call the modern tribes, right? So I know prior to European settlement, we do know that the Ho-Chunk lived in this area and the Potawatomi. The Sauk moved through further in the past, but when I'm looking at people 3,000 to let's say 7,000 years ago, we have no idea how they are connected with the modern tribes. I'm looking at people before there were even mounds. So there's no written records. All we have is archaeological data. We don't know who they are in a way that we can connect them to modern tribes. It's kind of like saying, for example, I'm German. we kind of talked about this earlier before. And I'm German, but what was I 5,000 years ago? Because I don't know. Germany, before there was Germany, there was Prussia. Before there was Prussia, the Romans called them the barbarians, right? And before that, what were they? And so my time periods that I'm looking at, we have archaeological names for them, like the Middle Archaic people or the Tiddington people, or the people who use Raditz points, but we don't know what they called themselves. We don't know how they're connected to modern people.
Excellent. Bill Green is asking, based on what you already know, what would you expect to find using GIS? What should the next steps be? What should researchers do to follow up on your study?
Okay, so what do I expect from the GIS?
No, not really what you expect, but based on what you already know and what you think you're going to find, what should the next steps be, and what should researchers do in terms of follow-up?
Oh, good question. So what are the next steps? Well, the thing is, the GIS presents a model, right? It looks at all the data that I'm giving it. It can do statistical analysis. That's why GIS is great. I don't have to actually do it myself. I don't have that kind of a statistical brain. The computer will tell me that during this time period, statistically, it looks like people like to live on this certain landscape, on this certain type of soil, near these certain kind of environmental factors. So the next thing that really needs to be done is that an archaeologist has to take this data and verify it. Actually go out in the field, do survey, do excavation, and actually try to find these sites. Otherwise, it's just a model that's not proven. It's just a possibility. So I think the next thing that has to happen is that, more research on the Pecatonica, specifically in areas that the GIS points to as being good areas. If then we find sites of that particular time period, then we can start saying that GIS has good evidence, and the data is being verified in the field, and we could start saying that is actually a very good potential settlement pattern. If we go out to areas that the GIS says would be a good site and we find nothing, you should also be doing geomorphological analysis to see if maybe the landforms that you thought were there just aren't there, representing those time periods, or that you have something missing in your model and you have to look at more environmental data, or there's just something that's not tweaked right with your theoretical ideas. So of course, as all archaeologists like to say, more work, but more field work instead of more computerized work.
Lori has a question. Does LiDAR have a role in your work?
LiDAR does. It's really good to find old oxbows that have been filled up and are forested now. So you get the idea of where the river was at various times in the past. LiDAR works really well with archaeology, especially when you're working with mounds, because you can find those mounds that are in wooded areas that have been plowed down. But that is a time period that is after mine. So it's one of those. LiDAR is helpful, not so much on the archaeology, but in defining the geomorphic features within the river valley that I'm looking at.
Great. Do we have any more questions?
Maybe slightly off topic, well, temporally at least. What happened to the Mactown settlement? Why was it abandoned?
The historic or the prehistoric?
The historic.
Okay, yeah, because prehistorically it was just always there, I think. Historically, so it was settled by Stephen Mack, who was a fur trader and a speculator out of Detroit, and he bought the entire parcel up and tried to make a town himself. He actually advertised, brought people out there. There might have been, I don't know, 20, 25 maybe residents out there. There were commercial industries out there as well. But Stephen Mack died in 1848. And that point across the river, across the confluence, you had the town of Rockton. And Rockton had a grist mill, a sawmill, or a mill. I mean, it had, it had power, water power that Macktown never did. And so it had the increase in commercial viability. Stephen Mack, the big, cheerleader for the town, died. In 1848, the bridge across the river that connected the state road got washed out, so it became hard to get to that town. And I think basically at the end, Macktown just lost because it didn't have the business viability that Rockton had across the river. Now, there are, well, some of the houses from Macktown did survive because they would float them across the river, bring them across on the ice, and set them up in Rockton. And I should also say that it was never called Macktown in the day. Stephen Mack didn't like that. He actually called it Pecatonica. But it just, the founder of the town died, the bridge to the town got wiped out, and the town literally across the river had steam power where Macktown didn't, and it just couldn't keep up.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I should say, if you're interested in Macktown at all, there should be another dig out there this summer in June, I do believe. I can get that information for you. The new Mars that's run by Jay Martinez does work out there for about 2 or 3 weeks every summer. They're working in a location that has shell, as they found a new shell site out there that's above on top of the bluff, dating to the early woodland. They're hoping that they have evidence of even earlier sites out there. That's the elusive lure of Macktown, is trying to find these earlier sites out there, because we know the river hasn't destroyed them. We just haven't found it yet.
Sarah, considering your background, you probably know all the regional museums.
I know a lot of them, yeah. Macktown has a museum. Actually, that the artifacts that I talked about from that Rockton hydroelectric dam relicensing project are now going to be donated to them. So that material is out there. For that region, there's a lot, like there's the Rockton Historical Society, the Logan Museum of Anthropology, which I know I was there when you guys came out and visited that not too long ago and had a tour of that museum. But there's a lot of museums in the area and along the Pecatonica, but a lot of them, they don't talk about the archaeology. So there's a lot of historical information.
Any other questions? Welcome to ask through chat or through unmuting yourself. Sarah, we're talking a little bit earlier about genealogy research. Have you, so you did some genealogy research about your roots in Chicago?
Oh, yeah. So for my last name is Pfannkuche, which means pancake in German. So although I'm also Irish, I do like to throw that in. When I went to Ireland, no one would believe me I was Irish because of Pfannkuche. It's like, I have a whole maternal side. But the Pfannkuche showed up in Chicago, not in the 1850s. And they actually settled in Bucktown. And my great-great-great-grandparents were there. My that was the maternal on my dad's, on the maternal side of my dad's side.
Mm-hmm.
And then the paternal side showed up in the 1880s. We have Louis Pfannkuche was, my grandfather was a fireman for the city of Chicago. He lost his house when they built the, oh my God, why can't I think of it? I drive it all the time, 90.
Okay.
At Ashland. They took his house out to put the interstate there. His father was a police officer in Chicago, and raised his family. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, we've had, when I first moved to Bucktown, actually, back in the 90s, I told my dad the apartment I was living in, and he then described the entire block to me. And I
Mhm.
couldn't figure out how he would have known that. He goes, "Oh yeah, your grandfather's fire station was 3 blocks down the street, and your great great aunts lived 5 blocks away, and I had a summer job 2 blocks away." So unbeknownst to me, I ended up moving to my family area.
Do you know of any resources for doing family research in the Midwest, in Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana?
Wisconsin, Indiana, not so much. Census, the great thing today is using, just the Chicago Public Library,
Okay.
because you could get the census records. Once you get one person, follow your parents back, and then if you go back in the census for enough, their parents are going to show up, and then their parents before. And the Mormons have digitized so much stuff that, in Ancestry, you throw a name in there. The only thing is you got to check. I'm lucky because Pfannkuche is an unusual name. There's only 5 families of Pfannkuches in the United States, and we're not related to each other. But if you have a common name like Baker, you just got to make sure you're following the right family. You might not all be related.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, Ancestry has done an amazing thing. The Newberry Library is a wonderful place.
Mhm.
My father is an archivist for the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Historical Society. And just if you find out your family worked for the railroad, they
Mhm.
have amazing genealogical
Oh,
records.
wow, interesting.
So yeah, because they trace back, this guy's the engineer. This is the guy's family. This is his father. They kept all those records too. So look at the typical, the Ancestry, but there's also check everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Good insight. We have another question
Sure.
from Lori. Are there any controls on private collectors now with what they can take and what they can do with it?
Good question. So private collectors, if you're collecting on your own property, it's your property. You can do what you want with it. The only kind of iffy situation is burials. Burials are protected in most states at this point. So you can't, if you have a mound, even if you have a mound on your property, you can't go dig it up. You can dig if you get permission from the property owners. Well, let me say not dig. Well, I guess you can dig. You can collect on other people's property as long as you have their permission. You cannot collect on state, municipal, county, or federal lands. So if you're in Jackson Park in Chicago and you find some historic brick and you're like, hey, this might be from the Chicago Fair, you can't pick that up. That's not that technical, that is illegal to collect. If you go down to Starved Rock and you find a projectile, one time I actually was hiking in Starved Rock and I found a projectile point coming out of an eroded gully. I couldn't pick it up because it's in a state park, even though I'm an archaeologist. So I had flagging tape with me because I am an archaeologist, and I flagged it, and I just, told the people who worked there that this is there. But even archaeologists have limited on what they can pick up and where. Burials, never. If it's your own property, you have no problem with it. If it's on state government property, you have to leave it alone.
Doing some of my own family research in Illinois, I was looking up the history of Putnam County and really saw the reason why those human burials are protected. There was a native chief in the area, and he had been dead maybe 80 years, and people decided to dig him up and all the stuff that was with him and put it in a little local museum. I don't know whatever happened to that stuff, but it was incredibly disrespectful, and native groups were making pilgrimages to his gravesite for many years, for many decades after his death, and just to see, what would happen to him. I don't know if it was, ever reburied or whatnot, but very curious as to what happened in the area, and definitely see a need for respect and restrictions on uncovering human remains, native remains.
I do know from work on the Pecatonica that looking at some historic records from the 1800s, that there are a number of mounds along the Pecatonica in the Illinois Reach. And people who lived on the property talked about, even though Native Americans were removed from this area after the Black Hawk War by 1835, Native groups came back as families to visit where they knew their ancestors were located. They would ask permission to go visit mound groups. One of the collectors, I was hoping to be able to look at his collection. He's 96 now, and he remembers as a child Native people asking to go on the property when he was a child to leave something at the mounds. So yeah, they are, we might think of them as mounds or just some leftovers from the prehistoric past, but there are people who still remember and honor them. And that's why we need to leave them alone.
Yeah. We have a question from Greg Kent. Has any in-water archaeology exploration been done?
So looking for artifacts in the water? Okay, so not so much. The Pecatonica is a pretty dirty and muddy river, especially once you get away from its source. And so there's very little visibility. I have not found anybody who would do that kind of work. I do know that part of the thing is we do know that the river, especially during flood stage, can erode archaeological sites that are in the banks. And so sometimes you find archaeological artifacts on the surface of when you're doing a surface survey. Especially after a flood, you have to ask yourself if that is an artifact that actually came from that location or if the water brought it in. The only in-water archaeology that I know of, it was done actually at Mactown. They were looking for the old bridge abutments, and they think they have found them. And so there's some historic archaeology that was done in the river, but that's all that I know of in that region.
Wonderful. All right, if there's no other questions, we'll start to close down our meeting. Sarah, if I could take control of the screen share, I'm going to just share my screen. Perfect. Good timing. All right. So I hope everyone loved what they saw here today and come back again. On the screen here, I'm showing our website and how to join, be a member and contribute. And for next time around, next month, we have, let's see here, Dr. Matthew Crystal. This is May 23rd, 2021 at 3:30. It's our tradition to maintain the forest, Indigenous water management in San Miguel, Pecatonica. So hope to all see you there. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for supporting the Chicago Archaeological Society. And Sarah, thank you. Hope to have you back.
I plan on coming back and visiting and giving you an update once the GIS is run. And thank you everybody for putting up with all my theoretical talk.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.